Leah's words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire, thick and suffocating. I've been sleeping with Roy since your 7th month, she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she stared into her coffee cup. I thought you should know before the baby comes. I sat across from her in the hospital cafeteria, 36 weeks pregnant, my hands resting on my swollen belly where our daughter kicked restlessly. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the plastic table between us, and somewhere in the distance, a vending machine hummed its mechanical tune. I had just finished my routine checkup, everything perfect according to Dr. Parker, when Leah suggested we grab coffee to talk about something important. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, literally minutes away from the maternity ward where I would soon give birth, receiving confirmation of what I'd suspected for months. My best friend of 15 years and my husband of 8 had been betraying me during the most vulnerable time of my life. The timing of her confession was almost artistic in its cruelty. Late enough in my pregnancy that I couldn't do anything drastic, but early enough to poison these final precious weeks. What Leah didn't know was that I had been expecting this conversation. In fact, I had been preparing for it. I took a slow sip of my decaf latte and smiled. Not the broken smile of a devastated wife, not the bitter smile of someone plotting revenge, but the calm, knowing smile of someone who had already won a game the other players didn't even realize they were playing. Thank you for telling me, I said simply, my voice steady. I appreciate your honesty. Leah's head snapped up, confusion flickering across her features. She had clearly expected tears, accusations, maybe even a scene. Instead, she got the same composed demeanor I brought to my work as a forensic accountant, the same methodical calm that had made me one of the most sought-after financial investigators in the city. Elena, did you hear what I just said? She pressed, leaning forward. Roy and we've been having an affair. I heard you perfectly, I replied, shifting slightly to accommodate another strong kick from the baby. How long has it been going on, really? Her face flushed. I told you since your 7th month. I nodded thoughtfully, filing away her first lie. It had actually started much earlier, but I wasn't surprised she was minimizing. That's what people do when they're caught. They tell just enough truth to feel better about themselves while still trying to control the narrative. And how do you feel about it? I asked, genuinely curious about her psychology. How do I feel? Leah's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby table. Elena, this isn't therapy. I'm telling you that your husband is cheating on you. With me. Aren't you angry? I considered her question seriously. Was I angry? Certainly. Hurt? Of course. But I was also something else entirely vindicated. For months, I had been gathering evidence, building a case, and preparing for exactly this moment. Leia's confession wasn't devastating news. It was the final piece of a puzzle I had been patiently assembling. I'm processing, I said finally. This is a lot to take in. That much was true, not because I was shocked, but because I was rapidly calculating how this confession would fit into the larger picture I had been developing. Leia volunteering this information changed several variables in my carefully constructed plan. Dr. Parker's voice crackled over the hospital intercom, calling for someone to report to the NICU. The sound made me acutely aware of where we were, surrounded by new life and hope, while Leia sat across from me dismantling the life I had built. The contrast was almost too perfect. I should probably head home, I said, beginning to gather my purse. Roy will be wondering where I am. That's it? Leia's voice was almost shrill now. You're just going to go home and pretend I didn't tell you anything? I paused, studying her face. There was something desperate in her expression, something that went beyond guilt or concern for my feelings. She needed me to react, to explode, to give her something to work with. The question was why. What would you like me to do, Leia? I asked calmly. Scream? Throw coffee in your face? Storm out dramatically? I thought you'd want to confront him, she said, her voice smaller now. I thought you'd want to know the truth. There it was, the real reason for her confession. She wanted me to confront Roy, to blow up our marriage before she had to make any difficult decisions herself. She was trying to force my hand, to make me the bad guy who destroyed everything over an affair that she could then frame as a moment of weakness or a mistake. But I had news for Leia. I already knew far more truth than she realized, and I had no intention of confronting anyone until I was ready, until I had everything I needed to ensure that when this all came crashing down, I would be standing firmly on solid ground, while everyone else drowned in the wreckage of their own making. The truth is important, I agreed, standing slowly and adjusting my coat over my belly. Thank you again for sharing this with me. I know it couldn't have been easy. I could see Leia struggling to process my reaction as I walked away. She had expected to shatter my world and instead found herself talking to someone who seemed to already live in a different reality entirely. What she didn't understand was that she hadn't told me anything I didn't already know. She had simply confirmed what I had spent months proving. As I made my way through the hospital corridors toward the parking garage, I felt my daughter's strong kick against my ribs. Soon, very soon, everything would change. But not in the way Leia or Roy expected. Not even close. The truth is, I wasn't surprised by Leah's confession. I had been watching the signs accumulate for months, each one adding to a picture that was becoming increasingly clear. The late nights when Roy claimed to be working on the Henderson account, the mysterious phone calls he took in the other room, the way Leah's behavior had shifted from supportive best friend to something more strained and artificial. It started in my 5th month, right around the time I was beginning to show enough that my pregnancy was becoming inconvenient. Roy had always been attentive, almost obsessively so, but suddenly he seemed to find reasons to be anywhere but home. Board meetings that ran late, client dinners that stretched past midnight, weekend work sessions that required his personal attention. At first, I attributed it to stress. Roy worked in commercial real estate development, and the Henderson project was legitimately demanding. A $50 million mixed-use development didn't build itself, and as the lead project manager, Roy was under tremendous pressure to deliver on time and under budget. But when I offered to bring him dinner at the office during one of his supposed late nights, he declined quickly, almost frantically. Too much chaos, he said. Too many moving parts. He'd grab something on the way home, except he wasn't at the office. I knew because I drove by that night on my way home from my own late meeting with a client. The building was dark except for security lighting, and Roy's car was nowhere to be seen. That's when I started paying attention with the same methodical focus I brought to my professional investigations. As a forensic accountant, I specialized in finding financial irregularities, tracing money through complex transactions, and uncovering patterns that others missed. The skills that made me excellent at detecting corporate fraud also made me very good at detecting personal betrayal. I began with his phone. Roy had always been casual about device security, the kind of person who used his birthday as his passcode and left his phone unlocked on kitchen counters. It took me less than 5 minutes to clone his device data onto a backup phone I kept in my office. Every text, call, email, and app notification would now mirror to a device he didn't know existed. The patterns emerged within days. Text messages to Leah that were deleted from his primary thread but preserved in my backup. Photos sent and received that never appeared in his main gallery. Phone calls at specific times that corresponded with my prenatal appointments or work meetings. Times when Roy knew exactly where I would be and for how long. But it wasn't just the digital evidence. Leah's behavior had changed too, in ways that might have seemed innocent to someone who wasn't looking for them. She started asking more detailed questions about my schedule, my appointments, when Roy would be home. She volunteered to help with baby preparations, but always seemed to have conflicts when Roy was around. She bought me gifts that seemed designed to keep me busy, spa packages during times when I hadn't mentioned being stressed, subscription boxes that required me to be home for deliveries, books about pregnancy that she insisted I read immediately. Most telling of all, she started looking different. Leah had always been attractive, but suddenly she was investing serious money in her appearance. New haircut, expensive highlights, a wardrobe upgrade that seemed focused on clothes that were decidedly not appropriate for casual coffee dates with her pregnant best friend. When I complimented her on a particularly stunning dress, she brushed it off, saying she was trying to feel more confident at work. Leah worked as a marketing coordinator for a small nonprofit. The dress she was wearing cost more than she made in a week. The financial patterns were perhaps the most damning. Roy had always been meticulous about our shared accounts, but suddenly there were ATM withdrawals that didn't match his normal spending patterns. Cash pulled from machines near Leah's apartment, near restaurants that were too expensive for her budget but perfect for the kind of date nights Roy used to plan for us. Credit card charges at florists, jewelry stores, lingerie boutiques, purchases that never made it home to me. So I made some quiet moves of my own. First, I secured our finances. Roy might have thought he was being clever with his cash withdrawals, but he hadn't considered that I had access to every account, every investment, every asset we had accumulated together. I opened a separate account at a different bank, one that only I could access, and began systematically transferring funds, not enough to trigger alerts or raise questions, but enough to ensure that I would have resources available when I needed them. Next, I documented everything. Every discrepancy, every lie, every piece of evidence was photographed, copied, and stored in multiple secure locations. I created a comprehensive timeline that mapped Roy's deceptions against real-world events, building a case that would be admissible in court if necessary. I had learned long ago that in disputes involving money and property, documentation was everything. I also began researching both Roy and Leah more thoroughly than I ever had before. Roy's employment history revealed a pattern I had somehow missed: previous jobs left under circumstances that were never fully explained, references that were friendly but vague, gaps in his resume that he had always glossed over. Leah's financial situation was even more interesting. For someone who claimed to be struggling with student loans and nonprofit wages, she was living well above her means. Luxury car payments, an apartment that rented for 3 times what she claimed to pay, credit card debt that suggested a lifestyle funded by someone else. Most importantly, I started building my support network. I consulted with divorce attorneys, not to hire them yet, but to understand my options and rights. I spoke with financial advisors about protecting assets during marital dissolution. I researched child custody laws and documented my pregnancy care to establish my fitness as a mother. I even consulted with a private investigator, not to hire surveillance services, but to understand what evidence would be most valuable if this situation escalated. The baby kicked harder now, as if sensing my tension as I remembered those months of careful preparation. Every prenatal appointment that Roy missed, every romantic dinner he canceled last minute, every time Leah asked pointed questions about our marriage, all of it had been preparation for this moment in the hospital cafeteria. But I wasn't ready yet. Leah's confession was premature, which meant I needed to adjust my timeline. Whatever had prompted her to tell me now, before I had completed my preparations, suggested that something had changed in their relationship. Perhaps Roy was pressuring her to leave her husband. Perhaps she was getting impatient with the secrecy. Or perhaps they had both decided that my approaching due date represented a deadline they needed to address. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Leah had just given me the final piece of evidence I needed, while simultaneously revealing that neither she nor Roy understood what they were actually dealing with. They thought they were managing a simple marital affair. They had no idea they were about to face a forensic accountant who had been building a case against them for months. That night, I sat in my carefully prepared nursery, surrounded by cribs and changing tables and tiny clothes, and reviewed my files one more time. Every bank statement, every phone record, every receipt and photograph was organized into a comprehensive picture of betrayal that would be impossible to deny or minimize. Roy came home just after 10, claiming exhaustion from another late client meeting. He kissed my forehead, asked about my doctor's appointment, and mentioned that he might need to work late again tomorrow. Same script, same lies, same confidence that I was too trusting and too pregnant to question him. I smiled and told him I understood. That business was demanding, especially with the Henderson project reaching its final phase, that I appreciated how hard he was working to provide for our growing family. What I didn't tell him was that I had already called the Henderson project office that afternoon. Roy had been removed from the project 3 weeks ago due to performance issues and unprofessional conduct. His replacement, a woman named Jennifer Parker, had been very helpful in explaining that Roy was no longer employed by the development company in any capacity. He had been lying about having a job for almost a month. Tomorrow I would begin making some phone calls of my own. Not to confront anyone, not to demand explanations or ultimatums, but to set in motion a series of events that would reveal the full scope of what Roy and Leah had been doing. Because if Roy was lying about having a job, if he was spending money we didn't have on an affair I wasn't supposed to know about, then there were larger questions that needed answers. Questions about where he was really spending his time, who was funding Leah's lifestyle, and what other lies might be hiding underneath the ones I had already uncovered. The investigation was about to begin in earnest. The next morning, I waited until Roy left for his fictitious job before making my first call. Jennifer Parker from the Henderson Project was even more helpful the second time around, particularly when I explained that I was Roy's wife and that his departure from the company had created some confusion about our insurance coverage and final paycheck. The picture that emerged was far worse than simple job loss. Roy hadn't just been terminated for performance issues. He had been fired for financial irregularities involving project funds, falsified expense reports, and what Jennifer carefully described as inappropriate relationships with subcontractors. The company had chosen not to pursue criminal charges in exchange for his immediate resignation and agreement not to work in the industry again. Roy had been stealing from his employer while cheating on his pregnant wife, and somehow he had managed to keep both secrets for weeks. I made my second call to Diana Morrison, the divorce attorney I had consulted months earlier. Diana specialized in high-asset divorces involving financial misconduct, which made her perfect for what was becoming a more complex situation than I had originally anticipated. Elena, Diana's voice was warm but professional. I was wondering when I might hear from you again. Has something changed? Everything has changed, I said, settling into my home office chair with my carefully organized files spread across the desk. I need to move forward, but there are complications we didn't discuss before. Diana listened carefully as I outlined the new information about Roy's employment status, the financial irregularities at his former job, and Leah's confession. She asked pointed questions about documentation, timeline, and evidence preservation. When I mentioned the substantial cash withdrawals that had been funding his affair, she grew particularly interested. Elena, we may be looking at more than just adultery here, she said carefully. If Roy has been using marital assets to fund an affair while concealing job loss and potential criminal activity, we need to involve other professionals. I'm going to recommend a forensic financial specialist who works with my office on complex cases. That afternoon, I met with David Ruiz, a certified fraud examiner who specialized in financial investigations involving marital misconduct. David was exactly the kind of methodical, detail-oriented professional I had hoped to find, someone who would approach Roy's financial behavior with the same systematic rigor I brought to my own cases. Your husband has been very busy, David said after reviewing my preliminary documentation. The good news is that you've already done most of the groundwork. The bad news is that what you've uncovered suggests a pattern of financial misconduct that extends beyond just hiding an affair. David explained that the cash withdrawals, credit card charges, and employment deception created a profile consistent with what he called lifestyle fraud, systematic financial deception designed to maintain appearances while engaging in high-risk behavior. The fact that Roy had been terminated for financial irregularities at work suggested that the behavior was escalating and possibly becoming compulsive. We need to move quickly, David warned. If your husband is engaging in financial misconduct on multiple fronts, he may be taking bigger risks to maintain the lifestyle he's created. The longer this continues, the more exposure you have to potential legal and financial consequences. That evening, I made my most difficult call. My obstetrician, Dr. Parker, was understanding when I explained that I needed to discuss the impact of severe stress on my pregnancy, particularly stress related to marital problems. She recommended a maternal-fetal medicine specialist who could monitor the baby more closely and help develop a birth plan that accounted for my emotional state. Elena, Doctor, Parker said gently, I want you to know that whatever you're dealing with, your first priority has to be your own health and the baby's health. Everything else can wait. But that's where she was wrong. Everything else couldn't wait. With each passing day, Roy was potentially creating more financial damage, more legal exposure, more complications that would affect our daughter's future. I couldn't afford to wait until after the birth to address what was happening. I needed to act now, while I still had some control over the situation. The next morning brought a call from David Ruiz that changed everything. Elena, I've been running preliminary traces on the financial patterns you documented. His voice was tense with urgency. We have a much bigger problem than adultery. I'm seeing evidence of money laundering, potentially involving your husband's former employer and several other parties. We need to involve law enforcement immediately. Money laundering. The words hit me like cold water, causing our daughter to kick violently in response to my sudden spike in adrenaline. This wasn't just about Roy cheating with Leah. This was about criminal activity that could destroy our entire family. What exactly are you seeing? I asked, forcing myself to remain calm despite the magnitude of what David was suggesting. The cash withdrawals your husband has been making correspond to deposits in accounts connected to several shell companies, David explained. The timing suggests coordination with his former employer's project funds. It looks like he may have been funneling money through the affair to disguise the movement of stolen funds. The room felt like it was spinning. Leah wasn't just sleeping with my husband, she was potentially helping him launder money stolen from his former employer. Her mysterious lifestyle upgrade, her expensive apartment, her luxury car payments, all of it was funded by criminal activity. David, I need you to be very clear about something, I said, my hands instinctively moving to protect my belly. Is my family in legal danger because of this? Potentially, yes, he said grimly. If law enforcement determines that marital assets were used to facilitate money laundering, they could move to freeze or seize accounts. You could find yourself under investigation as an unwitting accomplice. We need to act immediately to protect you and establish your innocence. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for several minutes, feeling my daughter's movements as I processed the full scope of what I was facing. This wasn't just a marriage ending. This was a criminal investigation that could send my husband to prison and leave me fighting to prove my innocence while raising a newborn alone. But as the initial shock faded, I realized something else. I wasn't just a victim in this scenario. I was a forensic accountant with extensive experience in financial crime investigation. I had skills, connections, and expertise that could be invaluable to law enforcement. Instead of being a passive victim of Roy's crimes, I could be an active participant in bringing him to justice. I picked up the phone and dialed a number I had hoped never to use. Special Agent Lisa Park of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division answered on the second ring. We had worked together on several corporate fraud cases over the years, and she knew my reputation for thorough admissible evidence gathering. Elena? Lisa's voice was surprised but pleased. What can I do for you? I think I have a case you're going to find very interesting, I said, looking at the files spread across my desk. It involves money laundering, marital fraud, and a construction company that recently terminated an employee for financial irregularities. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Lisa was already familiar with Roy's former employer. Elena, she said carefully, are we talking about Henderson Development? Among others, yes. And the employee who was terminated is my husband. The pause that followed was longer this time. When Lisa spoke again, her voice had shifted into professional mode. Elena, I need you to listen very carefully. Henderson Development has been under federal investigation for 6 months. We've been building a case involving fraudulent billing, money laundering, and bid manipulation across multiple projects. If your husband was involved in any of those activities, you need protection immediately. Federal investigation, 6 months, multiple projects. The scope of what Roy had gotten involved in was far beyond anything I had imagined. And somehow, he had managed to conceal his participation while using our marriage and our unborn child as cover for his criminal activity. Lisa, I've been documenting his financial behavior for months, I said, adrenaline sharpening my focus. I have bank records, phone logs, surveillance data, and timeline analysis. I think I may have evidence that connects his personal spending to the corporate fraud. Elena, do not say another word over the phone, Lisa interrupted. I'm sending agents to bring you in immediately. Do not contact your husband, do not alert anyone to this conversation, and do not touch any of the evidence you've gathered. We'll handle everything from here. What about Leah? I asked, thinking about my best friend's confession yesterday. She's been receiving money from him. She may be involved. Elena, please, no more details over the phone. We'll discuss everything when you're in a secure location. I hung up and looked around my home office, at the nursery visible through the open door, at the life I had been building that was now completely destroyed. In a matter of hours, I had gone from a pregnant woman dealing with an unfaithful husband to a key witness in a federal criminal investigation. But as I began gathering the evidence files that would soon be crucial to a federal case, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't broken. I was angry, yes, and heartbroken about my marriage, but I was also something else entirely. I was ready to fight. Roy had made a catastrophic error in judgment. He had chosen to betray and deceive someone who made a living uncovering financial deception. He had stolen from his employer while cheating on his wife, and then he had used his pregnant wife's trust to cover his tracks. Worst of all, he had involved Leah in criminal activity that would destroy her life along with his own. But what Roy didn't understand, what neither he nor Leah had ever understood, was that I wasn't just a victim to be managed and deceived. I was a professional fraud investigator who had been building a case against him for months. And now, with federal law enforcement ready to support me, I was about to make sure that all of his lies came crashing down at once. My phone buzzed with a text from Roy. Working late again tonight. Don't wait up. I texted back. No problem. Take care of yourself. What I didn't tell him was that by the time he came home that night, if he came home at all, everything would have changed. Federal agents would have my evidence, attorneys would have filed papers, and the careful house of cards he had built with lies and stolen money would finally collapse under the weight of the truth. The baby kicked strongly, as if sensing that our world was about to become very different. Soon, very soon, justice would finally begin. 2 hours later, I sat in a windowless conference room at the FBI field office, surrounded by agents and attorneys who were reviewing the evidence I had gathered over months of careful investigation. Special Agent Lisa Park sat across from me, occasionally looking up from my files with expressions of amazement and professional admiration. Elena, this is extraordinary work, she said, closing the thick folder containing my timeline analysis. We've been trying to trace these financial connections for months, and you've handed us a complete roadmap to exactly how the money moved and when. Assistant Agent Michael Torres, Lisa's partner on the Henderson case, was equally impressed. The documentation you've provided connects directly to irregularities we identified in the Henderson project accounting. Your husband appears to have been a key facilitator in moving fraudulent funds through personal accounts. Diana Morrison, my divorce attorney, sat beside me taking careful notes. She had arrived shortly after the FBI agents, prepared to protect my interests as both a federal witness and a spouse seeking divorce from a criminal defendant. What we're seeing here, Diana explained, is a classic case of using marriage and family as cover for criminal activity. Roy's pregnancy announcement and focus on family planning provided perfect cover for increased financial activity that might otherwise have seemed suspicious. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney James Walsh, was particularly interested in Leah's role in the scheme. Based on the evidence you've provided, it appears that Miss Patterson was receiving substantial cash payments disguised as gifts and personal support. The timing corresponds directly with money movement from Henderson development accounts. Leah doesn't work in finance, I said, still struggling to understand how my best friend had become involved in federal crimes. She's a marketing coordinator for a small nonprofit. How would she have known what Roy was really doing? She may not have understood the larger scheme, Agent Torres replied, but the pattern of payments suggests she was more than a passive recipient. The timing and amounts indicate coordination with specific Henderson project milestones. She was either actively participating or willfully ignoring obvious red flags. Prosecutor Walsh reviewed the timeline once more. Elena, based on what you've documented, we believe your husband was using the affair as a way to move stolen funds without creating obvious financial trails. Leah's role was to receive cash, use it for expenses that would otherwise have come from traceable accounts, and provide Roy with alibis for his time away from home. The picture that emerged was devastating in its calculated cruelty. Roy hadn't just cheated on me, he had used our marriage, my pregnancy, and my trust to facilitate criminal activity. Leah hadn't just betrayed our friendship, she had allowed herself to become part of a money laundering scheme that would destroy multiple lives. What happens now? I asked, suddenly feeling exhausted by the weight of what I had uncovered. Now we move quickly, Agent Park replied. We'll execute simultaneous search warrants at Roy's workplace, your home, and Leah's apartment. We'll freeze accounts connected to the fraudulent activity. And we'll arrest Roy and Leah on federal charges, including money laundering, theft, and conspiracy. How long do I have to prepare? I asked, thinking about the practical implications of my husband's arrest. I need to secure living arrangements, make sure I have access to clean funds, prepare for media attention. We move tomorrow morning, Prosecutor Walsh said, which means you have tonight to make any personal arrangements you need. But Elena, I want to be very clear about something. You are not just a victim in this case, you are our key witness. The evidence you gathered independently, before you knew about the federal investigation, is what will make conviction possible. Agent Torres nodded agreement. Your financial analysis provides the connection between Roy's personal spending and the corporate theft. Without your documentation, we would have had a much harder time proving the money laundering charges. As the meeting concluded, I found myself in the surreal position of being congratulated by federal agents for successfully investigating my own husband's crimes. The skills that had made me successful as a forensic accountant had also made me the perfect person to uncover and document Roy's betrayal. Diana walked me to my car as evening shadows stretched across the parking lot. Elena, I want you to know that what you did took incredible courage and intelligence. Most people in your situation would have confronted their spouse immediately, which would have destroyed evidence and made prosecution impossible. I just wanted to understand what was really happening, I said, feeling emotionally drained, but strangely peaceful. I couldn't make good decisions without good information. Well, the information you gathered is going to ensure that justice is served and that you and your daughter are protected financially. Diana replied. The government will seize Roy's criminal proceeds, but your legitimate marital assets will be preserved. You'll be able to start over without the financial devastation that usually accompanies criminal prosecutions. That night, I sat in my nursery one final time, surrounded by the baby furniture Roy and I had assembled together, knowing that by morning, everything would be different. Federal agents would be searching our home, Roy would be in custody, and Leah would be learning that her lifestyle upgrade had cost her everything. I thought about the conversation in the hospital cafeteria that had started this final phase of the investigation. Leah's confession had been intended to hurt me, to force me into a reaction that would benefit her somehow. Instead, it had provided the final confirmation I needed to move forward with consequences she had never imagined. Roy came home just after 11, same routine as always. He kissed my forehead, asked about my day, mentioned that he might be traveling for work next week. Even now, even hours before his arrest, he was still lying with the casual confidence of someone who believed he was smarter than everyone around him. "How was work today?" I asked, genuinely curious about how he would answer. "Challenging," he said, loosening his tie. "The Henderson project is reaching critical stages, lots of moving parts to coordinate." The Henderson project that had terminated him a month ago, the criminal investigation that would destroy his life in a matter of hours, the moving parts that included federal agents and prosecutors who were preparing to arrest him for money laundering. "I'm sure you're handling it well," I said, meaning every word. Roy had indeed handled his criminal enterprise with impressive organization and attention to detail. It was just unfortunate for him that he had chosen to commit crimes against someone who was better at financial investigation than he was at financial deception. "Get some rest," he said, heading for the shower. Big day tomorrow." I smiled and told him I would, because he was absolutely right. Tomorrow would indeed be a very big day. At exactly 7 a.m., federal agents knocked on our door with search warrants and arrest warrants. Roy answered in his bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, still playing the role of innocent husband and father-to-be. The expression on his face when Agent Park identified herself and announced his arrest was something I will never forget. Complete shock followed by the dawning realization that his carefully constructed lies had finally collapsed. "Elena," he called as agents handcuffed him in our living room. "Call Diana Morrison. Tell her to meet me at the courthouse. This is all a misunderstanding." I looked at him calmly, remembering every lie, every deception, every moment of betrayal over the past months. "Diana is my attorney now, Roy. You'll need to find your own." The confusion in his eyes was quickly replaced by understanding. He realized in that moment that I knew everything, that I had always known everything, and that I had been building a case against him while he thought he was deceiving me. "The pregnancy," he said, sudden understanding flooding his features. "You've been planning this." "I've been protecting our daughter," I corrected, "from the consequences of your choices." As agents led Roy away, Agent Torres briefed me on what would happen next. Leah had been arrested simultaneously at her apartment, where federal agents had discovered extensive evidence of money laundering, including cash, luxury goods, and documentation connecting her to the Henderson fraud scheme. "Leah is cooperating," Agent Torres informed me. "She's provided information about Roy's activities that corroborates your evidence. She claims she didn't understand the full scope of the criminal activity, but the evidence suggests more deliberate participation than she's admitting." Over the following weeks, as my pregnancy entered its final stage, the scope of Roy's criminal activity continued to expand. The Henderson development investigation revealed a multi-million-dollar scheme involving fraudulent billing, bid manipulation, and money laundering across dozens of projects. Roy had been a key facilitator, using his position to create false documentation and move money through personal accounts. Leah's cooperation with prosecutors revealed that she had received over $200,000 in cash and goods from Roy over a 6-month period. She had used the money to fund her lifestyle upgrade, while providing Roy with alibis and emotional support for his increasingly risky criminal behavior. Her apartment search revealed evidence that she had been actively helping Roy hide assets and prepare for possible flight if his crimes were discovered. The forensic analysis of their relationship revealed something even more disturbing. The affair had begun not as a spontaneous attraction, but as a calculated decision by Roy to recruit someone who could help him launder money and provide cover for his criminal activities. Leah's financial vulnerability and emotional dependence on male approval had made her an ideal target for manipulation. Roy had not only betrayed his marriage and stolen from his employer, he had systematically groomed and recruited his wife's best friend to participate in federal crimes. 3 weeks before my due date, both Roy and Leah pleaded guilty to money laundering and theft charges. Roy received a 7-year federal prison sentence. Leah, whose cooperation and claimed ignorance of the full scheme earned her consideration for reduced charges, received 3 years. The day Leah was sentenced, she tried to call me from the courthouse. I didn't answer. There was nothing left to say between us. She had chosen to betray 15 years of friendship for money stolen from a construction company, and she had done it while I was pregnant with my first child. No amount of explanation or apology could undo those choices, but Roy made one final attempt to contact me before reporting to federal prison. The letter he sent was delivered through his attorney, since direct contact with me was prohibited by court order. In it, he tried to frame his crimes as desperate attempts to provide for our growing family. He claimed that pressure to succeed, fear of financial instability, and concerns about supporting a child had driven him to make poor decisions. He asked for forgiveness, promised to make amends when he was released, and begged me to consider allowing him to be part of our daughter's life. I read the letter once, then filed it with the rest of the case documentation. Even in his final communication, Roy was still lying. The financial analysis had shown that his criminal activity generated far more money than our family expenses required. He had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars not to provide for his family, but to fund an elaborate double life that included luxury spending on his affair partner. More importantly, Roy had never asked for forgiveness for the betrayal that had actually hurt me most. He had apologized for the crimes, the financial deception, the legal consequences, but he had never acknowledged that he had used my pregnancy, my trust, and my love as tools to facilitate his criminal activity. He had treated our marriage not as a partnership worth preserving, but as convenient cover for federal crimes. On a warm Tuesday morning in late September, exactly 2 months after Roy's arrest, I gave birth to our daughter. Julia Elena Martinez arrived healthy and perfect, with dark hair and strong lungs that announced her arrival to the entire maternity ward. As I held her for the first time, I felt overwhelming love mixed with profound sadness. Julia would grow up without her father, not because of tragedy or illness, but because he had chosen criminal activity over family stability. She would someday learn that her father was in federal prison, that her mother had been the one to provide evidence for his prosecution, and that her birth had been surrounded by betrayal and legal proceedings. But she would also learn that her mother had fought to protect her before she was even born, that when faced with devastating betrayal, her mother had chosen justice over denial, evidence over emotion, and strategic action over destructive reaction. Julia would understand that sometimes love means making hard choices to protect the people who matter most. Dr. Parker visited during my recovery, both to check on Julia's health and to address something that had been weighing on her mind since my earlier conversations about stress and marital problems. Elena, she said as Julia slept peacefully in my arms, I want you to know that what you accomplished during this pregnancy was extraordinary. Most women in your situation would have been overwhelmed by stress to the point of medical complications. The fact that you maintained your health and delivered a healthy baby while dealing with federal investigations and criminal prosecutions speaks to incredible strength. I looked down at Julia's peaceful face, thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. I had something worth protecting, I said simply. During the following months, as Julia grew and thrived, I began rebuilding my life with the systematic approach I had brought to everything else. The house was sold, with proceeds split according to court order after restitution payments to Roy's victims. I moved to a smaller place better suited to raising a child alone, close to excellent schools, and with a community of other single mothers. My professional reputation, rather than being damaged by association with Roy's crimes, was actually enhanced by recognition of my role in the investigation. The FBI began consulting with me on other cases involving financial fraud and money laundering. Law enforcement agencies recognized that my combination of technical expertise and personal motivation had produced unusually thorough evidence gathering. I established a new practice specializing in financial investigations for divorce cases involving suspected criminal activity. The Roy case had taught me that many instances of marital financial deception were connected to larger criminal schemes, and that spouses were often the best positioned to detect and document illegal behavior. 6 months after Julia's birth, I received an unexpected call from Jennifer Parker at Henderson Development. The company, after completing its cooperation with federal investigators and implementing new financial controls, wanted to offer me a consulting contract to help improve their fraud detection systems. Elena, Jennifer said, what you uncovered about Roy's activities helped us identify systematic vulnerabilities that could have cost millions more if left unaddressed. We want to work with you to ensure this never happens again. The irony was perfect. Roy's former employer wanted to hire his wife to prevent future employees from committing the same crimes that had destroyed our marriage. I accepted the contract, both for the professional opportunity and for the poetic justice it represented. A year later, as Julia took her first steps across our living room floor, I reflected on everything that had changed since that conversation with Leah in the hospital cafeteria. My marriage was over, my best friend was in federal prison, and I was raising my daughter alone. But Julia and I were safe, financially secure, and surrounded by people who had proven their loyalty and trustworthiness. Most importantly, I had learned something about myself that I might never have discovered otherwise.